welcome to Varn blog. And today we're reflecting on really one of the key figures of political modernity, Thomas Hobbes. And while people know a lot of the basic presuppositions of Hobbes's theory of the sovereign, they often don't know why it is so different. After all, while the divine right of kings was never really part of the medieval mindset, the king as an extension of the sovereignty of God was, and those are two separate things. It's something you really have to parse. After all, the king was the chieftain amongst chieftains, effectively, from the failed Roman / Merovingian / Carolingian order. But the fundamental shift that happens with the first revolution in a lot of ways in Europe, and it's not the first revolution ever. There have been revolutions before and slave revolts before, but the English Civil War is, in some ways, the first bourgeois revolution proper. And Hobbes both embodies it but negates it. He is, in many ways, both the first liberal and the first anti-liberal simultaneously. He takes liberal assumptions of equality of science, but turns them on its head to justify an absolute monarch. And monarchical absolutism really was somewhat of a new concept. Well, there's some things akin to it in like caliphate-related Sharia. The idea of the monarch as the protector of the peace and as something separate from that, emerging out of human necessity, begins with Hobbes. But so does the idea that humans are atoms in a state of nature that need a social contract that is created by literal conquest. Now, we can contextualize this in the light of the English Civil War and the resulting aftermath are in the beginnings of modern science. They both fit. Now, I'm going to turn to one of the places I turn for classical political philosophy, which is Alan Ryan. I have back there, you can kind of see it, his big masterwork, as well as the supplementary volumes, of which this little volume is one of. This is on Hobbes, Escaping the War of All Against All, which of course I'll cite in my show notes. But I want to read this about the beginnings of political science, about how weird this really is, because Hobbes is more like the ancient Stoics, who we also decontextualize their metaphysical and physical theories for just their ethical theories. But their ethical theories were the results of their particular views of the world, which developed out of, the larger Hellenistic post-academy mindset. They also claim to go back to Plato and Socrates, the Stoics. But the Stoics and the Stoa and their Greek versions are way more radical than their later Roman ones, were fundamentally believers in a material universe that was made of God. That was why the fatalism was necessary for an ethical life. Very different from the Lucretian and Epicurean swerve, the ancient atomist, etc. But Hobbes is closer to them in some ways than to us in their attitudes. And yet, he invents the idea that human relations is a science, literally analogous to physics, because Hobbes believed that it was basically the same as the atomic level, which was not understood well at all when he was writing. So I'm going to read a little bit of Alan Ryan to help you get the context for this. We're on page 47 of this book. It's also in the big book back there, but there's more supplementary materials and stuff to read from Hobbes himself in here. So let's get into this. The first political scientist, ? Hobbes claimed that the science of politics was no older than himself. Before him, historians and rhetoricians, Cicero, Machiavelli, or Erasmus, gave advice based on historical evidence, engaged in simple moral extortions, or showed off their rhetorical skills. I mean, this is a similar claim to what we see Marx claiming, Hegel having solved philosophy, and now we can have a science of human history, right? This claim is not new. It is foundational to modernity. The current trend of intellectuals to turn against it, with the exception of like Peter Turchin and Clio dynamics, are old school resurrections of Marxism, for good and ill, is actually kind of a new trend in modernity. And by modernity here, I am going to say we are talking specifically about the modernity emerging out of the European world. I am a believer that other modernities were possible and actually existed in before industrial capitalism really made a lot of them unable to survive the onslaught of the productive capacity of capitalism, but nonetheless, they used to be. Hobbes claimed to be the first to put the understanding of politics on a scientific basis. And again, think about how many we've claimed this from Marx. He thought that the chief obstacle to the creation of a genuine science of politics was the self-interest of scholastic philosophers. Now, I have done a show on Irving Welsh's talk about the decline of scholasticism, was actually about the decline of the medieval university, of which was in total free fall by the time of Hobbes. And there would be another round of educational building and falling apart to come at the end of this period after the Restoration. Priests and professors, rhetoricians, and obscurantists, the way I feel about a lot of humanities people now. His particular bugbears were those who wanted to revive the ancient republics and the Roman libertas, and those who wanted to derive political authority from religion. Whether the bishops of the Church of England, the Pope, or the asserted self-proclaimed prophets who sprung up during the Civil War. To understand Hobbes as he would have wished, we have to explore this claim. Hobbes's life was deeply affected by two revolutions. One, the Civil War of the 1640s, and the other, the intellectual revolution associated with Galileo, Descartes, and the English scientists such as Robert Hooke, William Harvey, and Robert Boyle. The first led him to think that any society in which there was a doubt over the location of authority and its extent was doomed to civil war. If it avoided it, it was only by good luck. Leviathan spelled out the argument about the unity of the state consisted in the location of an absolute and arbitrary, and the arbitrariness is on purpose. I'm adding that. Legislative and executive authority in one person or body of persons. It's mostly in one person. The body of persons is like a minor concession. The sovereign, who might be one person, several persons, or an entire political community, usually is one person, Alan Ryan, possessed unlimited legal authority, and the subjects were obliged to obey in everything that did not threaten their lives, or, and this is another part that's often dropped, or require them to deny Christ. We have to remember, Hobbes was a heretical Christian who wanted to secularize the state, but he was a Christian, just a very fucking weird one. Kind of like Hegel. Even if they were required to deny Christ, they should do so, trusting God to know what was in their hearts. We should first place Leviathan in the context of Hobbes' intellectual allegiances, then very briefly explore Hobbes' idea of science. The modern reader is apt to be puzzled that Hobbes thought geometry was a science. Yeah, the modern reader is apt to be puzzled, but that is an ancient way of thinking. Plato, the Pythagoreans, all of those people thought geometry was the grounding for science as the most advanced mathematics, and that logic and metaphysics should reflect that, right? Think about the focus on the forms, which is both a mystical thing in Plato. It is very mystical. There's a whole esoteric tradition around it. It's partly preserved in the Islamic tradition around Plato, or the Islamic tradition around Plato. I should say the Islamic because it wasn't just Muslims, but it was all in the Islamic world where a lot of this was kept. There was some Platonism kept in the Christian world that survived the Justinian and Western purges in the in the first 800 years of Christianity, but most of that stuff was in the other West, the East-West, the Islamicate world. For those of you who wonder why I use Islamicate, it is because A, it isn't all Muslim, although it is all ruled usually by Muslim leadership, and B, I don't consider it to be apart from the Western tradition if you are locating the Western tradition as beginning and the Hellenistic and then Roman ways of thinking. Because there is a lot of Hellenistic and Roman thinking in Islamic thought, even including making Alexander the Great or Iskandar a prophetic figure. Anyway. And to wonder what sort of science Hobbes' theory of politics is. Yeah, I mean, I've often wondered how people claim political science is science, particularly since it's based usually on empirical observations of limited generalizability, but treated as if that generalizability is not limited. They're not even like doing as much work as Bayesian statistics. Yeah. Then we can analyze the central argument of the Leviathan, which takes the reader from a contentious account of human nature through a contentious picture of the state of nature and on to a still more contentious claim about the need to establish the sovereign authority and absolute and arbitrary power to determine and enforce law. Finally, we should notice how Hobbes makes this claim a lot less alarming by reminding us that prudent government will do much that it is not legally obliged to do, and will not do much that is legally entitled to do. So Hobbes is basically saying the absolute sovereign, if he's smart, won't actually use all his power, but you should give it to him anyway. Now, this creates problems for Hobbes. Hobbes' intellectual history and alliances are complex. As a young man, he hoped to make a name as a man of letters. His translation of Thucydides' The History of the Peloponnesian War, and the fact that he read Thucydides and Thucydides being a key thing in a lot of the more cynical realist takes on politics, is actually interesting in and of itself. The way that Marx focusing on a Hegelian reading of Epicurus is actually interesting when you think about what Marxist materialism ultimately ends up being. And his numerous later Latin poems, including a Latin autobiography, are accomplished and vigorous. After his famous encounter with the geometry and his discovery of new physical science, and it's funny because, Spinoza was also into geometry, and I will actually argue, and I believe Colin Drum would agree with me, having read Spinoza, he's more of an absolutist than Hobbes, but that's neither here nor there. Just something to note. He became passionate about optics, but also got into academic scrapes and quarrels in which he came out badly, particularly in a controversy with Wallace over the squaring of a circle and with Boyle over the possibility of a vacuum. So we got to remember Hobbes was trying to do science and literature for most of his career. His turn to politics is really late in life, actually. For our purposes, Hobbes's literary achievements and deficiencies of his understanding of the new physics only matter as they suggest that Hobbes was pitched into becoming a political theorist by events, and that he was telling the truth when he said that he would rather have lived a quiet life and studied optics. Yeah, he would have rather been Spinoza. Anyway, but Protestant or post-Protestant, heretical or whatever. Leviathan was one of the greatest works of political theory ever penned, but it gives a misleading impression of Hobbes' intellectual achievements. Leviathan praises political science at the expense of what Hobbes calls prudence, and prudence was Hobbes' term for classical statecraft, the attempt to derive maxims of sound political conduct from the analysis of history and observation of how people behave in difficult situations. It is what Aristotle sometimes, and Thucydides, Polybius, and Machiavelli always engaged in. This is kind of an auto critique of Thucydides, but it shares a lot of Thucydides and Polybius' assumptions. except that Hobbes really thinks in giving things to the absolute sovereign, you can get away from the cycles of decadence and Polybius. Classical statecraft was defended against Hobbes by his contemporary Sir James Harrington, who we don't read anymore, and afterwards by David Hume and others, who we do. So pre-modern and more modern. Hobbes was not a univocal critic of politics based on historical analysis and empirical observation. He had not only translated Thucydides in 1629, but engaged in some Thucydidean history of his own after the Civil War. To Leviathan, he added Behemoth, a little red volume, to provide what he called a historical narrative of the Civil Wars. It is there that he complained that the careless leaders of the classics had acquired views on tyrannicide that threatened peace. Hobbes's ambivalent reactions to the historical writings for political purposes had a simple bias. He thought that Thucydides was, quote, the most politic historiographer that ever writ, and agreed with him that democracy was an intrinsically unsound form of government, not the least because democracies got into self-destructive wars and were prone to faction and dissension. But history was put to a dangerous uses in the 17th century England. Republican writers were moved by their readings of a history to advocate tyrannicide, and others claimed that the lesson of history was that political freedom existed only in popular republics. Most writers, other than himself, he thought, were not thinkers. They decorated their political prejudice with historical allusions to show how well-read they were. The attack seems paradoxical. Leviathan is itself a masterpiece of well-tuned rhetoric. This is no accident. Rhetoric was acceptable as a servant of reason. If his discovery of the principles of political science were original as he thought, rhetoric would make the new science more digestible. That's why he didn't just give us geometric proofs for it, peeps. What made it science, however, was logical cogency, not literary attractiveness. Hobbes' first political work in his mature style was The Elements of Law. He had imagined a longer work in 3 positions inspired by his encounter with Descartes and his circle in Paris during the 1630s when he was young and his young master was touring Europe. It was to be in Latin and consist of sections on the nature of physical objects, de corpore, on man, de homme, and on the citizen, de cive. In the end, a third section appeared in 1642 in English as The Elements of Law, the first and only in 1655 and in 1658. The work was published as De Cive in 1642, and in 1647 is more nearly a first draft of Leviathan. Hobbes feared that his hostility to the pretensions of Parliament might endanger his life, but a skeptical and secular defense of an absolute monarchy was as unwelcome to those who believed that Charles I was king by divine right as his assaults on Parliament were to his friends of popular government. Yeah, Hobbes wasn't liked by any faction, really. His assault on the idea that the state aim at liberty for its citizens implied that a subjection to law, like all other forms of subjection, included slavery, is simply inconsistent with liberty. Nobody except its author could be happy with that conclusion. De Cive was written in Latin in 1642 while he was in exile in Paris. An unauthorized English translation appeared in 1647 and caused Hobbes great anxiety. But the one thing Hobbes could not or would not do to protect himself was keep quiet. Whether Leviathan was written to ease Hobbes' return to England is moot. Whether Hobbes' motives, it remains astonishing. Every page contains philosophical insight or assertions that repay scrutiny 350 years afterwards. Philosophically, the contentious and difficult view that human beings are no more than complicated mechanical systems. He's a precursor to cybernetics in that way, actually, and to the clockwork theory of the universe and Newton. Is argued with a mixture of deftness and clumsiness that remains engaging when computer analogies have been commonplace for decades. I mean, it's interesting to think about the idea of a human as a computer actually does in many ways go back to Hobbes' view of mechanical physics. Hobbes' insistence that sovereignty must be absolute, omnicompetent, indivisible, and ultimate is still fiercely debated, though rarely with reference to Hobbes. His views on the nature of law, the connection of church and state, religious toleration, and much else repay any amount of analysis. Before we engage it, we should ask what Hobbes' contemporaries made of it. They understood that Leviathan justified Hobbes' submission to the protectorate established by Cromwell. In 1651, Cromwell required subjects who wished to keep their property to engage with the new regime, that is, to swear allegiance. Only the better off and the politically active had decided whether or not to swear allegiance, but for them it was a controversial question. Many felt that since they had pledged their allegiances to Charles I, they could not go back on their word. Charles was dead and could neither hold them to their allegiance nor release them, but many felt bound to him and his heirs, as almost in a medieval context. The question, when a man was freed to take a new allegiance, is not explicitly released by the person to whom he had sworn allegiance before, was not easy, but Hobbes provided a clear answer. Once we have pledged allegiance to a government, be it a monarchy, an aristocracy, or democracy, we are obliged to obey it and help sustain its authority. A sovereign political entity exists to secure the safety of its subjects and can do so only if everyone upholds its authority. If, in spite of our efforts, the sovereign disintegrates, if the regime is defeated in war or dissolves in civil strife, we must submit to a new sovereign. No sovereign is truly a sovereign who cannot preserve the lives of his subjects. Everyone understood the implications. Once Charles I had been defeated in the Civil War and could not protect his subjects, they were free to pledge allegiance to whomever could protect them. Others said something similar. Hobbes was unusual in embedding the thought in a complex and comprehensive account of all our political rights and obligations. Many contemporaries fall back on St. Paul's injunction to obey the powers that be for the powers that are ordained of God, or the thought that Oliver Cromwell's forces have been victors in a just war, or on the appeals to the right of conquest by the English lawyers had always justified William the Conqueror's right to rule and the title of his successors. Most people acquiesced in the government of whoever could keep order and were grateful the war was over and had no need of philosophical assistance. Hobbes wrote for an audience that was used to thinking about obligations and whose support made a difference to whether or not the government of the day could govern. They were startled, for instance, by his claim that a man who submits to the conqueror with his sword at his throat submits freely. You do have the choice to die, according to Hobbes. This was not founding sovereignty on the right of conquest, a familiar move, but founding it on the consent and describing the nature of consent in a highly counterintuitive way, as if to save your life, you consent to conquest. There is something very imperial in that notion in Hobbes, and people often miss it. Leviathan and science. What Hobbes thought about science, and therefore political science, was surprisingly hard to say. What it is not is easy. It is not Aristotelian. It is not teleological. Take that, Hegel. And it looks behind appearances for the mechanism that explain appearances. It is decisively post-Galilean. Hobbes draws an analogy with the understanding of watch, and this would maintain throughout English thought way beyond Hobbes, even in the liberal mind. Someone who knows how a watch works can take it to pieces and put it together again. We are to take the state apart in thought. The last thing he wanted was anyone should be able to take the state apart in fact. One might complain that the mere ability to take a watch to pieces and reassemble it is no proof of understanding. A good memory might suffice. But Hobbes was interested in the fact that the watchmaker must understand what he dismantles if he is to see what is broken and repair it. A knowledgeable but clumsy horologist might be a poor watch repairer, but able to instruct a deaf assistant. What Hobbes talks of the art by which God creates nature and we create the state, the presumption is that just as geometry tells us how to construct perfect circles and rectangles, so science of the state building is the science of the construction of a perfect state. Actual states will deviate from perfection, so Hobbes is dealing with an ideal type, but an ideal type that tells us something in law based off something like physics and geometry and geometric physics. But just as drawn a straight line will deviate from perfect straightness, So here we have both a very ancient form of thinking, but also against an ancient form of republicanism. And we have it tied into modern, our pre and proto-modern scientific models. This is where the animization of man really comes in. Hobbes' science of politics begins with an account of human nature. And Hobbes tells us that we must go for the knowledge of it. Noste titorum, read thyself, he says. I totally messed up that line. Hobbes goes on to say that once we have read his account of our passions and opinions in Leviathan, the pain left another will only be to consider if he is not the same in himself. For this kind of doctrine admitteth no other demonstration. Hobbes distinguishes very sharply between the nature of our desires and aversions and their objects. What we desire and avoid varies from one person to another, and within one person from one time to another, but the nature of our passions is common to us all, at least according to Hobbes. Modern readers for whom science means the empirical physical sciences find it hard to know whether Hobbes believes that we have scientific knowledge of the physical world. We know that it is God's creation, and that He was and that He has the Maker's knowledge of it. That we have geometry. What about us? There are three familiar views, none of them easy to identify as Hobbes' own. The first is that our own knowledge of the natural world is a well-founded opinion. Physics provides natural histories of the physical world. The laws of physics summarizes what we know about the world and provides recipes for making future discoveries. Geometry is different because it is a knowledge of our own construction, despite what some people might say. And Hobbes insists that geometry is the only science with which the Creator has seen fit to bless humanity until science of politics. But when Hobbes lists the various branches of science, he lists the knowledge of the natural world among them. Second possibility is that our knowledge of the natural world is ideally like the knowledge of geometry. There are principles that nature must obey. The universe operates according to self-sufficient principles. The purpose of thought experiments of the kind Galileo recommended was to uncover those principles. Galileo's demonstration that a body in motion could continue in motion forever, contrary to Aristotle's view, involved asking us to imagine a ball rolling down inside a wine glass. It would travel up the other side of the glass to the height of it have been released at. If we now imagine that the side of the wine glass lowered until it became a flat plane, we can see that barring friction, the ball would travel forever because it would never reach the height from which it had started. QED physics shows how the world must work if it conforms to the model drawn by the scientist. The model has the irrefutability of geometry, but whether the world really conforms to the model is unanswerable. Which is something that we also see in Hume. Will the word always conform to the model? That's the problem of induction. A third position is one that Hobbes should have liked, but he contradicts it. The difficulty with the first view is that it implies that the universe might have operated according to principles quite different from those in which it actually operates. Hobbes agrees. It is God's universe, built as he chooses, and even for Hobbes would imply maybe built out of him. If he had chosen to build a universe on different principles, nobody could gainsay him. But it is not easy to make sense of that view because we cannot imagine what these principles might be. The difficulty with the second view is that one person finds self-evident what another finds counterintuitive. Hobbes' problem with the idea of a vacuum are evidence of that. A third possibility is to argue that there can only be one physics, just as there can only be one geometry. God could not have designed a different universe any more than Euclid had drawn up a different geometry. We now know that different geometries are possible, and Hobbes did not. The reason this matters to Hobbes or his modern readers is that many of the difficulties of Leviathan have roots in Hobbes' methodological convictions. It's not surprising that his readers found his ideas hard to swallow. Leviathan lays down principles for constructing a commonwealth, but the principles are not advice for the founders of republics or for statesmen or for insurgents, such as Machiavelli offered in the Prince of the Discourses. Hobbes rejects Aristotle's claim that politics is the realm of the rules of thumb, and we must be content with only as much certainty as the subject matter allows. But Hobbes has also changed the subject. If we're going to giving practical advice, he would have it be content with usually, but he rarely offers advice. Perhaps the most overt political advice is that Leviathan should be taught in universities. True science is founded, says Hobbes, on definitions, are the imposition of names and the reckoning consequences of names, which is very different than our view of science. So logical definitions and naming them are as part of the scientific method for Hobbes. Hobbes makes life harder for himself and the reader by insisting that naming is, in one sense, arbitrary, but also, more important sense, far from arbitrary. Blau, blue, and azzurro are synonyms of blue, and the names of the cover, none is better or worse than the others if they name the same visual experience. The definition of law, justice, and authority, and so on, can be in Latin, Greek, or English, but if well chosen, certainty can and will be achieved, and if ill chosen, confusion and contradiction will result. His purpose is to understand the nature of the sovereign authority and the nature of law, the nature of justice, and he says firmly, the skill of making and maintaining commonwealth consisteth in rules as doth arithmetic and geometry, not as in tennis play on practice only. So we're dealing with something that rules emerge from the abstract, as if physics. So he's very different from Marx, who derives the stuff from praxis. And this appears to what he has in mind when he says afterwards in Leviathan that the matters in question are not of fact, but of right. If we talk about the state as Hobbes thinks reason requires, we may not manage everyday life much better, but we shall not plunge into war because we are talking nonsense. If Leviathan has an ancestor, it is Plato's search in the Republic and elsewhere for the definition of justice, knowledge, piety, or courage. Its intellectual successor is modern economics. That's fun. And thus sociology, too. Like geometry, economics works from definitions to conclusions and abstracts away from human life to illuminate what its perfectly rational agents would do in their market interactions. It is not merely an empirical account of what most people happen to do, but an account of what people rationally must do, which of course never exists, and they also define rationality weird, but that is the preposition. Supposing our ends to be as theory supposes, and ourselves to be fully informed and rational, which we aren't, and the theory doesn't flow, but nonetheless, that is the assumption. In the same way, Hobbes offers a theory of what the human being must do if they are rational, well-formed, and fearful creatures he draws for us. Now, Hobbes actually does posit a myth, although he seems to actually believe it is literal, based off the idea that humans are basically, social atoms, like atoms, and move like atoms. Because remember, he is constructing this from geometric and physics assumptions. And this is why it's important not to separate these ethical or political theories from the metaphysical and methodological things that undergird them. You can advance them, you can synthesize them, you can change them, but you need to meet your doing so, because changing them has complications. But most people, including most smart activists, don't do this. They take this stuff ad hoc and don't try to reconcile the problems and the differences. We like great men, even though we're supposed to believe in productive forces and laws of history that are beyond the individual, and a lot of politics. We like rights, but we no longer believe in the things that priorly undergirded them, be they natural law or the social contract, because we know the social contract is a myth. We like individualism without the relationality of personalism, the prior view of individuals as existing in relations, both hierarchical and lateral, because we like the idea that we are our own self-caused and self-owning agents. It's very self-flattering. But it also is in many ways delusional, as nothing that is caused can be entirely self-caused, but is dependently originated, or has causes in its relations to others. All this is fundamentally different, but they begin with Hobbes. We'll come back to Hobbes in the next reflection. But the Leviathan emerges from the atom for Hobbes, and the atom as an expression of the form, of the abstract geometric truth of the universe. And in that sense, Hobbes is not a historical thinker, but a modern scientific one, although one that we would find weird because his metaphysical assumptions, being a mixture of Protestant Christianity and ancient physics, and the new physics emerging of his day, would be foreign to us. In some ways, none of us today can be truly Hobbesian because we don't have those assumptions. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and follow for more. Keep the peace.